Today's lecture video concentrates on both Locke's theory of primary qualities and Berkeley's critique of that theory. We'll be spending only a little bit of time on Berkeley's positive account, meaning the idealist theory that he proposes. For the most part, for this course, we are interested in why Berkeley argues that Locke's theory of perception, just like Descartes', inevitably leads to skepticism. Last time we focused on the charge that Locke gives us a veil of ideas conception of perception. We saw that many have argued that Locke's ideas do not so much act as a means to perception, but as a barrier to it. Locke's ideas seem to block our access to the real world more than they put us in touch with it. In looking at that criticism, we focused on Locke's understanding of simple ideas, of specifically secondary qualities. The secondary qualities are all the ways that we sensorially experience objects. Its color, smell, taste, texture, sound. As we said last time, Locke argues that those secondary qualities are ideas in us and are not in the objects themselves. The object's primary qualities emit corpuscles in a way that our senses pick up on in specific ways. This is how we come in contact with the objects of perception. We come at them indirectly. I compared the corpuscular thesis to contemporary science that tells us that objects are composed of minute particles that we cannot see with the naked eye. What we can see, though, is their collective effects, the way they reflect light, the way they bond together as solid, liquid, or gas, the smell their chemical compounds give off for us, whether they are experienced by us as hot or cold. All those effects come off of what Locke calls the object's primary qualities. Those primary qualities are, he tells us, in the objects themselves. This is unlike the secondary qualities that are not actually in the object. They are in us. Secondary qualities are the way we, via our senses, respond to those primary qualities and the powers they have to emit certain corpuscles to us. Here's Locke explaining this point. Such qualities, which in truth are nothing in the objects themselves, but powers to produce various sensations in us by their primary qualities, i.e., by the bulk, figure, texture, and motion of their insensible parts. Locke is a realist about the objects of the world. He does think that objects have material existence, and we can know about them, albeit indirectly. We can know this because of the primary qualities. The object's primary qualities, which are extension, shape, quantity, and motion, host what the object truly is in itself. And though we can't access that directly, we nonetheless can gain some kind of access to the true nature of objects through the ideas that they evoke in us. This means that the true nature of objects is the following. They have extension, meaning that they take up space. Being material objects, they have a quantity. They can be one single thing or multiple things. They are in motion or are at rest. And they have parts. They can be broken down further and further until you get down to its most minuscule components. And this is what constitutes an object's material nature. We saw that Descartes doesn't disagree with this. Descartes concluded that logic dictates that this must be the fundamental nature of material entities. They have extension, shape, and so on. On Locke's account, it is this material nature of the objects that allows them to affect our senses in particular ways, i.e., via their secondary qualities. Here's Locke explaining that the primary qualities resemble the objects themselves. Ideas of primary qualities are resemblances, of secondary, not. From whence I think it is easy to draw this observation that the ideas of primary qualities of bodies are resemblances of them, and their patterns do really exist in the bodies themselves. But the ideas produced in us by these secondary qualities have no resemblance of them at all. There is nothing like our ideas existing in the bodies themselves. They are in the bodies. We denominate from them only a power to produce those sensations in us. And what is sweet, blue, or warm in idea is but the certain bulk, figure, and motion of the insensible parts in the bodies themselves, which we so call. So last time we problematized the secondary qualities, we asked how it was that these were not in the objects, and yet were supposed to constitute real information about the object. But today we're going to look more closely at these primary qualities and ask if Locke is giving us a logically coherent picture of what perception is by positing them. First, let's look more closely at what Locke tells us about these primary qualities. Here he is reiterating the originating aspect of these primary qualities. First, the bulk, figure, number, situation, and motion, I think may be properly called real original or primary qualities because they are in the things themselves, whether they are perceived or no, and upon their different modifications, it is that the secondary qualities depend. So here we see that term again, things themselves. Locke wants to posit some kind of knowledge about the true nature of things, even if he argues that we cannot access that true nature with our senses. Remember that in the last video, we noted that this talk of things themselves has caused confusion and debate for Lockean scholars. Saying that we can know the true nature of things as they are in themselves is a direct realist claim. But Locke, at the same time, denies that we have that kind of direct access. Nonetheless, we're to understand primary qualities as belonging to the things themselves. The question is whether Locke can explain to us how we are supposed to know this about objects. As he explains it, we don't actually have any way of coming in sensory contact with primary qualities. So how can he posit this as knowledge? He writes, the reason why secondary qualities are originarily taken for real qualities and the other, i.e. primary qualities, only for bare powers, seems to be because the ideas we have of distinct colors, sounds, etc., containing nothing at all in them, of bulk, figure, or motion, we are apt to think them the effects of these primary qualities, which appear not to our senses to operate in their production. In other words, those primary qualities are all always effectively hidden behind secondary qualities. For example, as I mentioned in a previous video, my only way of having an experience of my desk as a physical object of a certain size and dimension is through what I see and touch. I see its shape by its color. I feel its hardness and its contours. These, though, are secondary and not primary qualities. In other words, an object's shape, i.e. figure in primary quality language, is only discernible to you by how your eyes pick up on its color or how your fingers feel its contours and so on. The question, though, is what remains behind all these secondary qualities that Locke is calling bulk. What is bulk without secondary qualities like hardness, color, texture, and so on? Here's Locke's explanation. Hence it is that we are so forward to imagine that those ideas are the resemblances of something really existing in the objects themselves, since sensation discovers nothing of bulk, figure, or motion of parts in their production. What Locke is proposing is that the primary qualities of the objects are underlying qualities outside of our sensory reach. They must be there to account for our sensory experience of the objects, but they are something that is extra experiential for us. The primary qualities constitute the object's substance or entity. Or rather, the substance or entity is what props up or constitutes the existence of these primary qualities. He emphasizes that this kind of fundamental extension is not the same thing as body. Rather, it's something that theoretically lies behind or beneath what we think of as an object's body, meaning that extension and solidity are not the same thing as hardness or the feeling of an object's contours. Extension is inseparable from these because it is what gives the object hardness or softness, depending on the object, and it's what gives the object contours that we can feel with our fingers or see with our eyes. What Locke is identifying via these primary qualities, meaning extension, figure, number, and motion, is the object's substratum. The substratum constitutes the object's fundamental substance. We can't directly experience that substratum, but Locke's theory of indirect realism requires that we posit it. The secondary qualities that we experience with our senses have to emanate from something. Just because we can't see or feel that something doesn't mean that it's not there. So the object's substance is not accessible to our senses at all. It's rather a supposition that Locke suggests our imagination posits, even if we can't truly formulate an idea of what that pure substance or substratum is like. Why can't we formulate such an idea? Remember that Locke is an empiricist, and he's told us that all our ideas are derived from experience. Experience comes from sensation, either of internal or of external origins. Because pure substance sits behind the perceivable qualities without actually being those qualities, it means that we can't have any kind of sensory experience of it. And Locke freely admits that that means that we cannot have an idea of substance. Here's Locke's explanation. The mind being, as I have declared, furnished with a great number of the simple ideas conveyed in by the senses, as they are found in exterior things, or by reflection on its own operations, takes notice also that a certain number of these simple ideas go constantly together, which by inadvertence we are apt afterward to talk of and consider as one simple idea, which indeed is a complication of many ideas together, because, as I have said, nothing imagining how these simple ideas can subsist by themselves, we accustom ourselves to suppose some substratum wherein they do subsist, and from which they do result, which therefore we call substance. In other words, Locke proposes that we presume a substratum to account for what holds all these separate simple ideas together. Substratum gets posited because our minds, perhaps our instincts, recognize that something must be holding all these simple ideas together. That complex idea, a thing that can be at once a shiny, round, red, tart, hard, etc., as in this apple, and yet still lies behind all these qualities, is presumed or theoretically posited. But you'll notice that Locke is very careful, as I'm trying to be careful, not to use words like reason or logic dictates that the substratum must be there. Those of you with some exposure already to Hume might have noticed some resonance in the passage I just read and some wording that Hume uses, which, if that is still unfamiliar to you, fear not, we will cover when we talk about Hume next week. But Locke doesn't say habit, as Hume does, but he does say a custom. And if you recall, Hume talks about habit/custom. Locke says that we accustom ourselves to the idea of an imperceptible foundational substance. Reason is out, so it must be something more like impulse or instinct that accounts for why we expect the existence of a thing that we have no idea or experience of. Why no idea? because Locke has told us that we can't have an idea of something we've never experienced. No experience means no idea. In other words, you can't even use your imagination to dream up what this pure substance or substratum is like. How could you? You've never even had one experience of it, ever. This presents a problem. If we can't have any ideas about primary qualities or the substance or substratum, how can Locke or anyone tell us anything at all about them? Where would such information come from? Descartes also grappled with this, but in a way that gave him an answer. This is effectively the same conversation as Descartes was having about the wax. Because Descartes prioritized reason and divorced reason from sensation and imagination, he was able to say that we have a clear and distinct perception of an object's fundamental properties through reason alone. That's why Descartes can say that reason and not sense perception or imagination gets us to the true nature of the wax. We can borrow Locke's language to say that what remains in the candle as it melts and loses all its sensory qualities is the object's substratum that connects it over time through all these physical permutations. On Descartes' account, we don't need a sensory experience of that substratum or fundamental substance to posit its existence. Logic and reason dictate that it must be there. Locke, though, has already rejected the proposal that logic and reason can tell us anything a priori about objects, either internal or external. Locke must tell us that our imagination, not reason, posits the object's substance, despite the fact that we have no idea of it on his own account. Here's Locke making the case again. So that if anyone will examine himself concerning his notion of pure substance in general, he will find he has no other idea of it at all, but only a supposition of he knows not what support of such qualities, which are capable of producing simple ideas in us. Thus, contrary to what Descartes claimed in that wax example, substance or substratum is absolutely not known clearly and distinctly. In fact, it's not known or knowable at all. And thus here, as in all other cases where we use words without having clear and distinct ideas, we talk like children, who, being questioned what such a thing is, which they know not, readily give this satisfactory answer, that it is something, which in truth signifies no more when so used, either by children or men, but that they know not what. This is why Locke sometimes calls substance an archetype. I should note that I am emphasizing that Locke says this, but I need to emphasize that he's not alone. When Locke is talking about primary qualities, substance and substratum and archetypes, he's well placed in the thinking of the scientists and philosophers of his day. Leibniz also talks about substance and archetypes, and so did a scientist named Robert Boyle, who was a contemporary of Locke's and was largely credited for having discovered the theory of primary qualities as archetypes accounting for our experience of objects. This term archetype, which in the context it's used here can be defined as an original that has been imitated, emphasizes that the substratum or substance is not exactly a real thing. It's rather a kind of underlying form that is responsible for the object's external form. Now, I'm going to make an additional note. Do not get confused by other thinkers who have used these same words in different contexts. Locke's archetype is nothing like Jung's archetype, except that they both are talking about a kind of standard original formulation. And form here is also not like Plato's forms. Locke does think that the object's fundamental property is material, but here he's looking for language to explain to us what such an object might be if it's void of experienceable sensory qualities. Remember last time when I was emphasizing that Locke thinks that most, but not all, complex ideas resemble the things themselves. The one caveat he had was that the complex idea of substance is an exception. Substance, he says, does not resemble the object and cannot constitute knowledge. Here's that passage again. Secondly, all our complex ideas, except those of substances, being archetypes of the mind's own making, not intended to be copies of anything, nor referred to the existence of anything as to their originals, cannot want any conformity necessary to real knowledge. Locke then identifies that substances are the one kind of complex idea that does not resemble the object. Nor is it a copy of anything. For Berkeley, this is a problem on multiple levels. To explain why, let's shift gears at this point to examine Berkeley's text. The three dialogues between Hylas and Philinus, which many of you perhaps have already had a chance to read in Phil 210 or other courses. If not, no worries, we'll be recapping the significant aspects for our purposes. Berkeley argues that Locke's theory of perception, just like Descartes', leads us down a path to skepticism, where we end up concluding that we can't know anything about the world outside our own minds. Locke wants to say that there is a really existing material world, and that we can know about it, albeit indirectly. But Berkeley makes the case that the arguments Locke uses to convince us that secondary qualities are not in the objects, plus the position that the primary qualities themselves are unknowable to us, leaves us in a place where we logically have to conclude that we have no knowledge of objects at all. Berkeley makes this case by concentrating on Locke's primary qualities and on his theory of substance. The first 20 pages of Berkeley's first dialogue largely mirrors Locke's argument about secondary qualities. Berkeley has no problem with the proposal that sensory information is nothing but ideas. For Berkeley, the problem comes not from saying that sensation is ideas-based, but rather from saying that objects have a fundamentally material substratum. Berkeley, you may have learned in a previous class already, is an idealist. What does that mean? It means that he denies mind-body dualism, the proposal that there is a hard-to-surmount division between the material and the immaterial. He does that by denying materiality. There's no problem with saying that sensation is an idea for Berkeley, because he concludes that everything is ideas. Everything. Meaning material substance and physicality itself is an illusion. Berkeley's idealist proposal comes as a result of a problem that both Descartes and Locke identify. Actually, it stems from an issue that not just these two, but a whole host of early modern philosophers and scientists were grappling with during the period we're studying. The scientific revolution, of which not only Descartes and Locke, but also Galileo, Copernicus, Newton, and so many others were a part of, brought with it the shocking discovery that the world and the universe are not what they appear to be to the naked eye. Science discovered that reality is so much more than the mere human senses can realize. Here's how Robert Merrihew Adams, the editor of the Hackett edition of the Dialogues, puts it. One of the great scandals of contemporary thought, in Berkeley's eyes, was the gulf it set between the way physical objects appear to us through our sense perception and the way they are in themselves. This gulf was marked by a distinction that is closely associated with the scientific revolution of the 17th century. What the scientific revolution showed was that the universe is very different at both the microscopic and macroscopic levels. This is what led scientists, not just Locke, to distinguish the properties of an object from its sensory qualities. Here's atoms again. Colors, sounds, tastes, odors, and heat and cold, as felt by touch, are counted among the secondary qualities. Robert Boyle, the famous chemist, or natural philosopher as scientists were called in Berkeley's time, introduced the terms primary quality and secondary quality to mark the distinction. Berkeley's treatment of it is commonly regarded as a response to John Locke, who was much influenced by Boyle. But the distinction can be traced back through Descartes to the beginnings of the scientific revolution in Galileo. Berkeley, like many of today's philosophers, pushed back against this growing theoretical gulf between what the mind thinks and what the nature of the world really is. It may sound strange on first hearing, but Berkeley's idealism is actually meant as a kind of direct realist response to the indirect realism and rationalism we've seen in Locke and Descartes. How so, you may be wondering? Idealism seems even less direct realist than either of those options. We've seen that both Descartes and Locke struggle to connect physical sensation to non-physical thought. In both cases, we find that there needs to be some kind of mediator, or some kind of difficult-to-identify method to connect these two entirely different kinds of phenomena. The mind and the body, meaning the non-physical and the physical, are so different in nature and kind that philosophers to this day still struggle to make sense of how exactly they causally interact with each other. Descartes' solution to the problem was to give us two simultaneous streams of being, a physical one and a non-physical one. We saw that this mind-body dualism applies not just to how consciousness actually interacts with the body, it also applies to his conception of ideas. We end up with a sensation-based stream of ideas and a reason-based stream. Locke, on the other hand, gives us a single stream of ideas that are derived from physical sensation, either coming from external or internal sensation. Still, the gap between non-physical understanding and physical objects requires the mediation of ideas. Our ideas are supposed to be non-physical, i.e., mind-based, but they're also supposed to reflect material physical reality in an indirect way through our sense organs. But Berkeley will show that this is incoherent. The real problem in Berkeley's eyes is that the theoretical division of the world into physical and non-physical that prevents us from having a more straightforward view of perception. Berkeley doesn't deny that sensation is ideas based. If he can prove that the objects of sensation are also ideas based, meaning the objects of the world are also ideas as much as our ideas in our minds are, then he can maintain that the complication of how mind and object connect is eliminated. Now you've got a direct line between the objects and the ideas. They are now one and the same kind of thing, in the sense that they are both non-physical, i.e. non-material things. For Berkeley, the solution to Locke's and Descartes' problem is to say that the senses can put us in direct contact with the world. Idealism, meaning the view that everything is ideas, including external objects, allows for this direct connection. I don't want to delve too deeply into Berkeley's idealism. I'm hoping that you've learned it already elsewhere. Instead, I want to make use of Berkeley's argument to help us reveal more about Locke's indirect realism and its potential problems. But in brief, it's enough for our purposes to know that Berkeley denies that there is such a thing as a material substance. Before he makes that case, though, he devotes most of the first dialogue to rejecting the indirect realism and the rationalism of both Locke and Descartes. His most obvious and consistent attack, though, is against Locke, and that's what I'm going to highlight for us here. Let's look at Berkeley's rejection of Locke's conception of substance or archetype. He gives us several logical arguments against them in the first dialogue. Even though few philosophers today agree with him on idealism, many do at least agree with his reasons for rejecting Locke's indirect realist account of substrata. The three dialogues are framed as a discussion between two philosophers, Philonous and Hylas. Hylas is a Lockean indirect realist about perception. Philonous represents Berkeley's thought. Here is Hylas giving us a straight-out account of Locke's theory of primary and secondary qualities. Hylas says, I frankly own, Philonous, that it is in vain to stand out any longer. Colors, sounds, tastes, in a word, all those termed secondary qualities, have certainly no existence without the mind. But by this acknowledgement, I must not be supposed to derogate anything from the reality of matter or external objects, seeing it is no more than several philosophers maintain, who nevertheless are the furthest imaginable from denying matter. He goes on, for the clearer understanding of this, you must know sensible qualities are by philosophers divided into primary and secondary. The former are extension, figure, solidity, gravity, motion, and rest, and these they hold really in the bodies, or briefly, all sensible qualities beside the primary, which they assert are only so many sensations or ideas existing nowhere but in the mind. Those words could have been taken right out of Locke's essay concerning human understanding. Berkeley's main argument is that it is incoherent to propose that there are insensible qualities that lie behind the sensible ones. First of all, Locke seems to be proposing, with his primary quality of extension, or what he seems to be proposing, is a kind of absolute extension, a universal category of sorts, of some necessary entity that we both do and do not know about via sensation. Here's Berkeley, in the mouth of Philonous, explaining this problem. First he quotes, in italics, the Lockean proposal, and then he explains what's wrong with it. He writes, the red and blue which we see are not real colors, but certain unknown motions and figures which no man ever did or can see are truly so. Are not these shocking notions, and are not they subject to as many ridiculous inferences as those you were obliged to renounce before in the case of sounds? He goes on to enumerate the problem with each one of the primary qualities, but let's look specifically at what he says about solidity. He writes, then, as for solidity, either you do not mean any sensible quality by that word, and so it is beside our inquiry, or if you do, it must be either hardness or resistance. But both the one and the other are plainly relative to our senses. In other words, Locke has told us that extension is not the same thing as body. The physical hardness or shape that we see and touch of the surface is supposed to be distinct from the object's fundamental extension. But, says Berkeley, why would you separate these two? Isn't your experience of an object's hardness and shape a direct experience of its extension? What would extension be besides this? Meaning, it's hard to conceive of what you could possibly mean by bulk or solidity or extension apart from things like hardness, contour, shape, or your sensory experience of its physical being. Also, Berkeley argues that the proposal of a substratum leads to an infinite regress of substrata. How so? If you say that the surface of the wood table needs a substratum to account for its extension, then what accounts for that extension? Do you need another substratum to explain where the extension that supports the wood surface comes from? A substratum? And what about that substratum? Does it need another substratum to account for it? And so on to infinity? Here's Berkeley. Whatsoever therefore you suppose spread under anything must have in itself an extension, distinct from the extension of that thing under which it is spread. Consequently, every corporeal substance, being the substratum of extension, must have in itself another extension by which it is qualified to be a substratum, and so on to infinity. And I ask whether this be not absurd in itself, and repugnant to what you granted just now, to wit, that the substratum was something distinct from and exclusive of extension. One thing that isn't immediately clear from Locke is whether the substratum, to what extent the substratum is underlying extension as a separate thing. Sometimes Locke talks about the substance as if it is the collection of all the primary qualities, or whether he does seem to imply, and I'm trying in my own language in this presentation to walk carefully in my own wording. The archetype, I believe, is meant to be the thing underlying all the primary qualities, but other times it seems that the primary qualities is equal to the substratum. What Berkeley is suggesting here is that there must be a substratum underneath the primary qualities to account for the extension, and then perhaps another substratum under that to account for the substratum underneath the extension. And we end up with this long list of things underneath the object, all of which we can have no direct sensory experience of. As I said before, Berkeley does believe that our immediate sensory sensations put us in touch with the world, different from Locke. For Berkeley, there isn't an extension spread out under or behind the table to prop up its primary qualities. There isn't an archetypal layer to existence that we can't see or know but still somehow have to posit is there. The table is as we experience it to be, with the one exception that we think the table is mind independent when it isn't, on Berkeley's account. And in this particular sense of the term, Berkeley is a kind of direct realist. Next video, we'll look at that more closely by reading the West article about both Berkeley and Thomas Reid's take on skepticism, representationalism, and ideas. Here's Berkeley reminding us through Hylas that he is in fact a direct realist about perception. He says, "I assure you, Hylas, I do not pretend to frame any hypothesis at all. I am of a vulgar case, simple enough to believe my senses, and leave things as I find them. To be plain, it's my opinion that the real things are those very things I see and feel, and perceive by my senses." At the same time, he agrees with Locke that everything the mind contemplates, including sensation, is fundamentally ideas. What he thinks Locke is doing wrong is to posit that there is a material world outside the mind and non-material ideas inside the mind. Berkeley argues that this kind of thinking logically leads you to deep skepticism. If you follow Locke's thinking, Berkeley argues, you end up in despair. You end up having to acknowledge that you can't know anything at all about the world. Here's the exchange that ends up knocking the wind out of poor Hylas, who discovers that he cannot hold on to Locke's theories and certain knowledge at the same time. Hylas says, "Properly and immediately, nothing can be perceived but ideas. All material things, therefore, are in themselves insensible, and to be perceived only by their ideas." And Hylas says, "Ideas then are sensible, and their archetypes or originals insensible?" "Right," says Hylas. "But how can that which is sensible be like that which is insensible? Can a real thing in itself invisible be like a color, or a real thing which is not audible be like a sound? In a word, can anything be like a sensation or idea but another sensation or idea?" Hylas admits that it can't be so. Only ideas can be like ideas. So Philinus then goes on. Consider, therefore, and examine these ideas, and then tell me if there be anything in them which can exist without the mind, or if you can conceive anything like them existing without the mind. And Hylas says, upon inquiry I find it is impossible for me to conceive or understand how anything but an idea can be like an idea. And it is most evident that no idea can exist without the mind. And Philinus responds, you are therefore by your principles forced to deny the reality of sensible things, since you made it to consist in an absolute existence exterior to the mind. That is to say, you are a downright skeptic. What is Berkeley's point here? Berkeley is identifying the problem that arises from Locke's attempt to connect immaterial ideas to material objects. Locke is trying to give us a theory that connects our sensible experiences to the things themselves, even while he tells us that those things are fundamentally beyond the reach of our sensible experience. But this presents an obvious problem. It means that Locke has to posit that our ideas that are solely based on sensation can tell us something about things that are not available to sensation at all. But how is this possible? I've already pointed out that Locke himself says that we cannot know anything about these archetypes or substances. So how can we know that they are even there? We're talking about something that is supposed to be completely beyond the bounds of our knowledge. So how can you say anything positive about it? For all we know, there is no material substance there at all. For all we know, we're living in a computer simulation, and that's the cause of our ideas of secondary qualities. By the way, that would be a modern twist on precisely what Berkeley is proposing. Second, Berkeley is arguing that when you talk about ideas and then about some kind of externally existing material archetype, you're talking about two completely different and incompatible things. What does he mean by that? Locke tells us that these archetypes are not able to directly generate ideas in us. What they do is emit their powers via primary qualities that emit corpuscles, and those corpuscles generate ideas in us. So the substance or archetype itself is completely outside our sensory abilities. But what that means is that your mind has in it ideas that exist only inside your mind. But then you have a material substance outside of your mind that doesn't generate ideas. It generates things that generate ideas. And in a sense, you end up with a kind of mind-body dualism, precisely the Cartesian conception that Locke was trying to avoid with his empiricism. But unlike with Descartes, Locke doesn't even give us an alternative to the mind-body gap. Descartes was able to propose that reason is the mind-based thing that allows us to know about the world via another mind-based thing. That is, the intellect or reason can deduce what is real solely by considering the logic of ideas alone. What you have in Locke is a mind-based thing, ideas, that are supposed to mediate between objects and the mind. But how can that work if ideas are a mind-based thing? They aren't, properly speaking, a mediator at all. They're just more mind stuff. And so these ideas, says Berkeley, can't be like the objects they're supposed to connect to. Why? Because objects are not like ideas. Only ideas are like ideas. What does he mean by that? For one thing, ideas are fully mind-dependent, meaning that if you don't have a mind, you don't have ideas. Ideas are 100% reliant on a mind for their existence. But that's not true of material objects, at least on a non-idealist picture of the world. For the non-idealist, meaning for someone who doesn't deny the existence of external material objects, as Locke did, things outside the mind are mind independent, meaning they are not supposed to disappear if one is there to think about them. They are supposed not to be reliant on minds for their existence. So Locke is supposed to be saying that only ideas have reality to the mind. But if you can't connect these ideas to material objects outside the mind, then you lose the ability to assign reality to those objects. Suddenly nothing is real. Except for ideas, that is. Only ideas remain on this view, while the things they represent disappear on you. You lose existence of the objects. Let's look again at how that conversation at the end of the first dialogue ended. Hylas said, "Upon inquiry, I find it is impossible for me to conceive or understand how anything but an idea can be like an idea. And it is most evident that no idea can exist without the mind." And Philinus responds, "You are therefore by your principles forced to deny the reality of sensible things, since you made it to consist in an absolute existence exterior to the mind. That is to say, you are a downright skeptic." So perhaps that Berkeleyan view of what Locke is saying is uncharitable. Is this really where Locke leads us? After all, Locke's intent was to give us an empiricist account of sense perception as a solid foundation of knowledge. And Locke clearly says over and over that the objects themselves are real and that our ideas of objects do resemble what the objects themselves really are. Nonetheless, there is this problem with the primary qualities of objects that I think Berkeley is right to draw our attention to. Even on Locke's own wording and arguments, those primary qualities start to disappear the closer you consider what they are and how we're supposed to know about them. Locke is clear that the object's substance, its underlying extension, figure, number, and motion as a single complex idea, accounts for the material object's existence and its ability to affect us sensorially. And yet, he insists that that substance is unknowable to us, specifically because we can have no sensory experience of it. At the same time, he doesn't want to follow Descartes and propose that we can deduce the substance's existence via reason or logic. And what's more, he's also told us that you can't have an idea of anything that you don't have an experience of. So you can't even imagine what a substance or archetype is. This gives us a pretty shaky epistemological foundation for our knowledge of objects then, doesn't it? It suggests that the core nature of objects is unknowable to us. Doesn't this leave us with no possible way to prove or even recognize the realness of any objects, at least of the ones existing outside the mind? In this sense, Berkeley is right to say that the only thing that is real in the Lockean scheme is our ideas of secondary qualities. And the foundation of those qualities, they are backed up by an assumption of some kind of unknowable, nonsensible something that you can't even prove is there or is anything like what you think it is like. What we end up with is effectively precisely Descartes' worry about sense perception. You end up in the first meditation where you can't find any proof that anything you are experiencing is real. It could all be an illusion, the trick of some evil demon, or if you prefer, of some superspecies running a computer simulation. We've lost the foundation of knowledge and don't even have Descartes' a priori, "I think, therefore I am," to help us out of it. This is why Berkeley argues that the Lockean path leads you to complete skepticism. On that path, you end up with the conclusion that we have no knowledge of anything at all. At least this is where Hylas ends up. Here's poor Hylas at the beginning of the third dialogue. He's fully lost at that point. He says, "Truly my opinion is that all our opinions are alike vain and uncertain. What we approve today we condemn tomorrow. We keep a stir about knowledge and spend our lives in the pursuit of it, when, alas, we know nothing all the while. Nor do I think it possible for us ever to know anything in this life. Our faculties are too narrow and too few. Nature certainly never intended us for speculation." And he concludes, "There is not that single thing in the world whereof we can know the real nature or what it is in itself." Skepticism is not Berkeley's goal. In fact, he's arguing full on against skepticism. Berkeley proposes that the way to avoid that kind of skepticism, both the Lockean and the Cartesian type, is to join him in rejecting the existence of material objects. Idealism is supposed to be a hopeful, non-skeptical, and, odd as it may sound, direct realist explanation for perception that reconstitutes the grounds for our knowledge of the world. Once again, the reason for that optimism, at least on Berkeley's view, is that if you say that everything is ideas, then you can say that you do truly know the nature of things. They're ideas, ideas held in the mind of God, which gives them genuine external existence of a non-material kind. So that's one option, not a very popular one, admittedly, though, as I've said, we don't really have the time in this course to explore Berkeley's positive account. I will point out, though, that the proposal tends to sound less crazy if you think about it in the context of Eastern spiritual traditions. Buddhism is based on a metaphysics that isn't all that different from what Berkeley is proposing. Philosophers after the early modern period have more typically taken a different route, though. There are two main or obvious options to solving the skepticism that comes out of the hard problem of consciousness, meaning the gap that inevitably exists between the conception of non-physical thoughts and material objects. You can deny materialism, as Berkeley did, or you can deny non-physical thoughts and propose that everything is fundamentally physical in nature. We've seen a little bit of Thomas Reid already in last week's lecture, and we'll visit him again in the next one. He is a rare early modern example of materialist, direct realist thinking. We, however, will have to encounter Reid's direct realism indirectly. We'll read about his views through Peter West's article that finds an unexpected or unintuitive symmetry between Berkeley's idealism and Reid's materialism. Though their philosophies are diametrically opposite to each other, what they share in common is that they think Lockean indirect realism and representationalism lead to skepticism, and so must be wrong. More on this next time. So that's today's lecture. Thank you everybody again for listening. Look for the next video in the next few days, Thursday night or Friday morning at the latest. Thanks everybody. See you next time.